Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
What's up, everyone, and welcome to the America's Founding series on the P.A.S. Report podcast, where we dig into the remarkable individuals who helped shape this great nation. And many of these people that I speak about have been ignored. They've been scrubbed from the textbooks, reduced into the footnotes of history. But today, we're spotlighting James Wilson. And it's a name that most Americans have never heard of, despite his remarkable contributions to this country. His fingerprints are all over the United States Constitution, and he is one of only 6 men who is both a founder and a framer. Someone who signed the Declaration of Independence and helped create the United States Constitution. This puts him in rare company, and it wasn't that Wilson just showed up to sign pieces of parchment. That's not what he did. He was one of the most influential architects of the American system of government. But Wilson, he wasn't just a witness to history, because he shaped it. From advocating independence in a skeptical Pennsylvania to crafting the philosophical and structural foundation of our country, Wilson stands as a pillar of the American experiment. His ideas about popular sovereignty, an energetic executive, fostering a compromise with the Electoral College, and the idea of an independent judiciary still echo today. And by the end of this episode, I think that we will all agree that James Wilson deserves a lot more credit than he actually gets. In fact, Wilson's imprint on the Constitution runs so deep that some scholars call him the forgotten founder who never should have been forgotten. And let's get into why James Wilson matters, why it's time that James Wilson gets his due. Because he was born in Scotland in 1742, immigrating to America in his early 20s, at a time when a lot of the founding fathers are actually being born in the United States. He decided he wanted to settle in Pennsylvania. He was steeped in Enlightenment thought. He would constantly quote people like John Locke and Montesquieu, and he was a student of law. He studied law under John Dickinson, and yes, the same John Dickinson who initially opposed the Declaration of Independence. Wilson would quickly establish himself as a brilliant legal mind and as a patriot that would fight for liberty and freedom. So when the Continental Congress convened, Pennsylvania was extraordinarily divided. You had a lot of leaders who actually leaned loyalist. But Wilson, despite the political risks and the pressure on him, he was a fierce advocate for liberty. He was a fierce advocate for American independence, and he helped persuade a divided Pennsylvania delegation to back the Declaration of Independence. He became one of the signers. Now, it didn't hurt that another fellow Pennsylvanian was advocating the Declaration and actually helped write it, and that's Benjamin Franklin. When we look at James Wilson and Benjamin Franklin, for that matter, without Pennsylvania on board, let's be honest, the American Revolution would not have succeeded. The Continental Congress would have collapsed, it would have fractured, and the revolution would have been over. But what made Wilson unique wasn't just his political courage, it was his legal mind. Even before Jefferson penned the famous words, "all men being created equal," Wilson had been writing and speaking about the natural rights and the moral basis of law. He was speaking about God-given rights of man, and to him, legitimate government wasn't based on the whims of kings or royalty. It wasn't based on shifting moods of legislative bodies. What gave governments their legitimacy was the consent of the governed. You have to understand that what our founding fathers are doing at this point in history was radical thinking at the time. But this radical thinking is supposed to be embedded in our DNA as Americans. But too often we forget that because we don't teach our real history anymore. You look, in 1774, James Wilson published a pamphlet, and here he's going to argue that all human beings are free. And he declared that the British Parliament had no authority over the colonies because the colonies do not consent. These are the types of arguments that are rooted in natural law, the idea of popular sovereignty. And his belief was simple. It was simple, but it was powerful. The government derives its powers from the consent of the governed. And I know that sounds familiar. Now, fast forward to the summer of 1787. And this is where Wilson's going to arrive at the Constitutional Convention as one of Pennsylvania's delegates. And he wasn't just quietly standing in the corner. He was someone that was outspoken. He was very active, and it was very hot. Many of the founding fathers, the framers of the Constitution, were getting agitated. There was a lot of difference of opinion that was going on. There were the Federalists, the Anti-Federalists. Should we have a unicameral legislature, a bicameral legislature? What type of leader should we have? Should we have a monarch, or should we have what's called a president? And then what's the judiciary going to look like? Wilson was one of the most active delegates, speaking at the convention more than 160 times. And James Madison, to his credit, James Madison was like the record keeper over there. He did a pretty good job capturing the environment of what was taking place at this convention and the debates that would happen. When you look at how often James Wilson spoke, he was second only to Gouverneur Morris, who I showcased on the America's Founding series just a few weeks ago. But it wasn't just the quantity of his speeches that he gave. It was the substance of those speeches. It was the quality. You have to understand that Wilson provided the intellectual framework for much of what became our federal system. This idea behind federalism that most students today have no idea what federalism even means. They don't understand federalism as a form of government. It really is disgraceful what has been going on. And Wilson repeatedly insisted that the people, not the states, the people were the true source of government authority. Wilson argued that the people are the ones that are the masters of government, and that the government is like our servant. To Wilson, popular sovereignty, the idea that power emanates from us, from we the people, was essential. And that's why it's so sad that he's been lost to history, because this belief, this principle, has been the cornerstone of the United States for 240 plus years. This belief guided so many of Wilson's proposals. He also argued that we need a single energetic executive. And Hamilton explains this well in Federalist 70. And Wilson was on board with that. He wanted a president who wasn't a puppet of Congress, but someone with enough power that can act decisively. You know, a lot of times people talk about issues and qualifications, but when we read Federalist 70, when we look at the works of Wilson, we see that they wanted a president that had enough power to have enough energy, to have good leadership. You know, as it's argued, weak presidents equal weak governments. Weak governments equal bad governments. But he didn't want a president that just had total power. The idea was controversial. Many delegates feared that if you have this all-powerful presidency, it's going to return to the days of monarchy. But Wilson stood firm. He said, you need the executive authority, and it should be vested in a single person, an executive authority that's not just ceremonial in nature. We need an executive authority, but to protect us against a tyrannical regime, to protect us against a dictator, we have to introduce the separation of powers. We have to introduce a system of checks and balances. Now, when it comes to electing a president of the United States, Wilson wanted a national popular vote. He was an advocate for that. But he saw that wasn't going to be possible because, let's be honest, the power centers that existed at the time, the population centers, were Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. Well, in order for this Constitution to pass, you need 9 out of the 13 states that vote to support it. Rhode Island's not even participating in the process, so now you're going to need 9 out of 12 states. Why would Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Connecticut, New Jersey, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, why would any of them support this new Constitution? Delaware, Maryland, I want to give them their due too. Why would they support this new Constitution if they felt the executive authority is just going to do what's in the interest of the most populous states and the other states are going to be ignored? And so what Wilson did is he helped shape the compromise that would begin to unfold, the Electoral College. He believed that the Electoral College can capture the will of the people, but it wouldn't create a system where a president would simply be beholden to the people. Now, there were some that balked at the idea. There were some that didn't like the Electoral College. They feared it would empower the states too much. And when we look at the Electoral College, it was seen as a middle ground. It's not a perfect system, but it's the best system that exists. And to this day, Despite all the Electoral College's flaws, it still is really the greatest system. We have to remember what POTUS actually means. It's not really President of the United States. You're not wrong if you say that. But it's really President of these United States. The President is not necessarily the President of the people. He's the President of all the states combined and the people within those states. That's where the Electoral College actually comes from. And Wilson didn't stop there. He also laid the groundwork for what would become known to be an independent judiciary. See, in Wilson's view, courts weren't just arbitrators of disputes. They are now going to serve as guardians of the Constitution. And he envisioned that the courts would interpret and enforce constitutional boundaries. He also understood, and he wasn't naive, that the judiciary would never be equal in power to the legislative and executive bodies. Wilson understood that it was going to be the weakest of the three branches of government, that it's going to lack the sword and the purse. Its strength, he argued, is going to lay in its ability to interpret law, not make it, not engage in judicial activism, but interpret the law. And to protect the people when the other branches of government overreach, the court has the moral authority. And he said that laws may be unjust, they may be unwise, they may be dangerous, they may be destructive, and yet not be so unconstitutional as to justify the judges in refusing to give them effect. He warned us about this. And even then, he knew the courts would have its limitations. And when we look, it's not like Wilson's influence just stopped when the convention ended. In Pennsylvania's ratifying convention, this man delivered a legendary 3-hour speech defending the Constitution. There were still a lot of people who were very suspicious about this new Constitution that was developed. There were many people that still, they wanted to try and figure out a way to resurrect the Articles of Confederation, despite the fact that it was beyond resurrection. You weren't fixing it. But Wilson wanted to persuade. He wanted Pennsylvania to become the second state to ratify this Constitution. And here's something that many of you did not know. Wilson was actually initially opposed to the Bill of Rights. Not because he was against individual liberties, he was a champion of individual liberties, but because he feared that if we listed specific rights, that's going to lead future generations to assume that anything that's not listed doesn't exist. He believed that listing certain liberties and not others risks limiting liberty. And when we look at the Ninth Amendment, that's why the Ninth Amendment is so important. Now, we need to take a quick break. When we get back, I want to talk more about James Wilson's impact and why he should not be a forgotten founding father, why everyone should know who James Wilson is. Now, if you are enjoying the America's Founding series, take a moment to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who needs to hear more about the forgotten voices of America, the forgotten voices of our founding, because every bit helps. And I want to get back to James Wilson. I want to get back to how he helped shape America's identity, especially our legal identity. Wilson was a jurist, and he laid some of the legal groundwork in America. After the Constitution was ratified, President George Washington tapped Wilson to become one of the first justices on the United States Supreme Court. And on the bench, he continued to shape early American jurisprudence, and the most important case under his watch was Chisholm versus Georgia in 1793. In that case, the court ruled that a citizen of one state could sue another state in federal court. And Wilson's reasoning was that the states were not sovereign over the people. Rather, the people are sovereign over the states. This was a bold assertion of federal power and judicial authority, but it sparked immediate backlash. States feared that they were going to be dragged into federal court by private citizens all throughout the country. And so after this ruling, the result was that Congress and the states moved quickly to pass the 11th Amendment, which barred these types of lawsuits. And it's interesting because that's the way the system is supposed to work. Congress has the power to overturn Supreme Court decisions through the constitutional amendment process. Now, I will say this off the bat. I'm not the biggest fan of the 11th Amendment. This is where we see sovereign immunity, which limits our ability to hold government accountable. And I believe that if government fails to live up to their commitments, which our government certainly has on routine occasions, they should be able to be sued. I believe that government has failed and they should be held to account. Even though the Supreme Court decision was overturned through a constitutional amendment, the case still solidified one key principle. And this is going to be that federal courts do have some authority. They may not be able to enforce their rulings, but they do have some authority, and they have a moral authority. That was Wilson's view in action. And outside the courtroom, Wilson was a lecturer. He gave a series of law lectures that were incredibly influential and helped shape the early legal education system within the United States. He believed deeply in legal transparency, and he wanted ordinary Americans to understand the law because the law derives from us. Unfortunately, today, you try and read some legal jargon, it's not the easiest to interpret. So his idea of legal transparency has kind of gone out the window. But despite all the contributions of Wilson, he died in poverty. He died in disgrace. This isn't like it is today where a president leaves office and they're getting $300,000 a pop per speech. This isn't like you're an influential figure. You could go make $20,000 on the speaking circuit. Wilson, he made a mistake. He invested heavily in land speculation, borrowed money to buy frontier land that he thought was going to appreciate in value, couldn't afford to pay that money back, and the land bubble burst. And with that, his finance burst. He was actually arrested twice for debt. He was fleeing from creditors. He died in 1798 at the age of 55, and he was virtually forgotten. He was disgraced because of those financial issues, and that's the sad part. James Wilson should not have been forgotten. He wasn't just a signer on the Declaration of Independence. He was a thinker. He was a framer. He was a builder of the American system, and his financial issues doesn't diminish his legacy one bit. If anything, it makes his contributions more remarkable because we see that he's a human being. We see he was an ordinary person that may have made bad financial decisions, but he was still capable of doing extraordinary things. And that's like the true story of America, is it not? He is someone who believed in a government of the people, not just rhetorically, but structurally. And he helped craft the balance of powers, the presidency, the Electoral College, the judiciary, all with the goal of maintaining liberty through restraint. See, Wilson understood something that we still wrestle with today. Government has to be powerful enough to govern, but limited enough to preserve our freedom. And he understood the delicate balance between the rule of law and popular sovereignty. More importantly, he knew that the only way to keep that balance is if the people remain vigilant, if we constantly were skeptical of government, ask questions, stay informed. He is someone that viewed public service in its rightful form, that public servants, and by extension, the government exists to serve the public. And he said, quote, "Government, in my humble opinion, should be formed to secure and to enlarge the exercise of natural rights of its members. And every government, which is not this in view, as its principal object, is not a government of the legitimate kind." That's James Wilson, and his words still ring true today. Now, I want to thank you for listening to this week's episode of America's Founding Series on the P.A.S. Report podcast. And if you found the episode informative, share it with other people. Leave a review. Take 30 seconds, write a good review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. It helps the podcast get discovered by more people. Make sure that you subscribe to the P.A.S. Report podcast. And if you haven't already, check out previous episodes of the America's Founding Series. Listen to the episodes on Filippo Mazzi, Crispus Attucks, Governor Morris. There are so many stories of America's founding that few of us know. And I think it's really important to reignite that American spirit and gain an appreciation for our founding and our history. Remember, our founding and the Constitution wasn't just written. It was built. It was built brick by brick by people like James Wilson and Filippo Mazzi and Crispus Attucks and Governor Morris and so many more forgotten heroes that played a role that we're going to highlight on the P.A.S. Report podcast. So I want to thank you for joining me, and I'll be back next week with more great episodes of the P.A.S. Report.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at PASreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.